At the very heart of Kant's ethics is something known as the categorical imperative. And the very first version he gives is called the formula of universal law. The formula of universal law is the most fundamental principle from a theoretical point of view of Kant's ethics. So we're going to talk today about what that principle is and what it implies about ethics, but I want to say just a word about where it comes from. Remember, we talked about a good will as the thing, the one and only thing, that is good without qualification. A categorical imperative is an imperative, a do or do not, a thou shalt or thou shalt not, that applies under any circumstances whatever. So categorical imperatives are ideally suited for things that are unqualified goods. If something is a good without qualification, then we can tell you as a categorical imperative to seek it no matter what. Well, since there is one and only one thing that is good without qualification, namely a good will, there's really only one categorical imperative that we can give, which is have a good will. That is to say, do the right thing for the right sort of reason, because it is the right thing to do. Act out of duty, or have a good will in short. But what exactly does it mean to have a good will? Well, we said it was a matter of acting on the basis of universal considerations. And so that leads us to this formula of universal law. It's one of only a number of formulations of the categorical imperative. It's rather surprising, actually. Kant says there is one and only one thing that is good without qualification. So there is one and only one categorical imperative, and then he gives you 5 different versions of it. Some people react to this by saying, well, there isn't really one principle, there are 5 principles, and they're all slightly different. I don't think that's true, and certainly Kant doesn't think that's true. He thinks they're all equivalent. They're all ways of explaining the same thing, and they all give you the same underlying moral truth. They are the formula of universal law, the formula of the law of nature, the formula of humanity, the formula of autonomy, and the formula of the kingdom of ends. Well, today I want to just focus on the first. I do think it is the most fundamental, the formula of universal law. Here it is. Act only on that maxim you can at the same time will to be universal law. In other words, act as if everyone were going to act on your maxim. Informally, we could just say, don't make an exception of yourself. Well, he uses a technical term here, a maxim. What does that mean? It means something like a principle. In fact, he defines it as a subjective principle of volition. It's roughly speaking the reason I'm doing it. I'm operating by a maxim. So I'm deliberating about what to do. Let's say I'm in Plato's situation of having loaned this knife to a friend, promising to give it back when he needs it. He comes to me in a state of rage, out of his mind, with fury, and asks for it back so that he can do something horrible with it. Should I give it back? I deliberate, and I think, I don't think it would be the right thing to do. And so I act in a way that I'm going to make some excuse. I'm going to try to not make him angrier. But on the other hand, I'm not going to give him this knife back. Why? Well, because I think now it's something that he's going to do terrible things with. So, for example, I then say, I make my excuse. And if somebody asks me why, I say, well, because he was out of his right mind. He was intent on committing mayhem. I thought I needed to prevent that kind of harm if I could. Well, I'm expressing there a reason for action. I'm also expressing a sort of maxim, which is break a promise if fulfilling that promise is going to lead to, well, I could put it in consequential terms, to disastrous results, is going to lead to someone's death, is going to give someone who is irrational a tool with which they can do great damage. So I might formulate it in different ways, and there are differences there. I need to think carefully about exactly what my maxim was. But Kant is going to say, think about your maxim of action. Are you willing to apply that maxim across the board to every similar situation? Are you willing to have everybody else act according to that same maxim? In this case, I might well say, yeah, I don't want people giving weapons to deranged people who are intent on mayhem. Yeah, I'm very happy to universalize that maxim. I'm not making an exception for myself here. I'm not saying, well, normally I would judge that, yes, you should give it back, but I don't want to, so I'm not going to. It's not like that at all. I am willing to apply that across the board. But some people do make decisions and act on maxims they wouldn't be willing to apply across the board. Kant says, in fact, a paradigm of immorality is a matter of making an exception for yourself. Now, we're not just talking about people here who are obviously hypocritical, obviously unprincipled, obviously violating something or drawing special favors for themselves that they wouldn't permit anyone else. That's common enough, and there is indeed hypocrisy, that kind of unprincipled behavior. So that's a good example of a violation of this. But there are other violations too. Kant says, consider a murderer. Are murderers really living by a different set of rules? No, they're making an exception for themselves. They don't want to be murdered. If you catch a murderer and you say, all right, now I'm going to murder you, they don't say, well, I'm cool with it. Live by the sword, die by the sword. No, they don't want to be killed. They don't want to be murdered. What about the thief? The thief has been stealing from other people. If you steal from the thief, is the thief cool with it? No, they don't think it's good for you to steal from them. They aren't willing to tolerate that. They're applying a maxim that they're not willing to apply to themselves. In fact, they don't think people should steal from them, but they steal from others. And so Kant says typically murderers, thieves, other people who violate those kinds of moral maxims are doing exactly this. They aren't rejecting the rule. They would apply that rule to anybody else and say, well, you shouldn't murder me, you shouldn't steal from me. But they make an exception for themselves and do it anyway. So that is the basic idea of the formula of universal law. There is a moral test that goes along with this law, and that is really implicit in it already. If we want to test an action to find out whether it's morally permissible or not, we first of all identify its maxim. We think, okay, let's see, can I steal that thing that I would really like but can't afford? I identify the maxim. Think, steal what you really want but can't afford. Then I think, could it be a universal law? Could everybody go by the maxim, steal what you really want and can't afford? Well, if the answer is no, if we can't even make any sense of the idea of everybody following that rule, then the answer is no. This thing is wrong. It is not permitted. And in fact, it's unjust. You are violating somebody else's rights if you do it. But suppose I answer yes. It could be a universal law. Then say, well, all right, fine, it could be. Would you will it? Could you will it to be a universal law? If the answer is no, then it's immoral. It is the wrong thing to do. If so, then it's permitted. Now notice, this is an issue about whether something is permitted or not. It is not saying that if so, you must do it. It's saying if you can't will it, you must not do it. And that's a different thing. So let's take a particular case and think how it goes. I have to identify the maxim, the rule, the principle, the reason, and then I say, could everybody act on that maxim? Could everybody act according to that rule or principle? And then, if so, I say, could a rational being will it? Could a rational being actually will a universe and living in a universe and being subject to that where everybody is acting that way? So here's a simple case. Should I steal? Here are a couple of kids stealing apples. Well, should I steal? I identify the maxim, steal. Maybe it's more specific. Steal what I really want if I can't afford it. Steal it if I think I can get away with it. Depends, right? It depends how the person's thinking about it. Maybe they think, hey, want it? I'll just take it. Maybe they're thinking, I can't afford it, but I'd really like it. Maybe they're just thinking, nobody's around, I won't get caught. Anyway, whatever they're thinking, that goes into the maxim. Then we ask, could that be a universal law? Well, could everyone go around stealing from everyone else? Kant's answer is no, it could not happen. There would then be no such thing as stealing because there would be no such thing as property. So stealing is unjust. It is not only wrong, it violates people's rights. Now that's surprising and fast, and it's also an odd way of arguing. But think about what he's saying. He's saying, look, could I get away with stealing here? Maybe I could get away with it. But morally speaking, may I? Is it permitted that I steal this? Well, what if everybody stole what they wanted? Everybody, at any point, could just take anything they wanted. That means there would really be no such thing as owning anything. You mean they could come in and steal my glasses? Well, they wouldn't be my glasses, right? I wouldn't have any right of ownership over them because anybody could take them. The rule would be, hey, take whatever you want. So nothing would really be mine. It would be mine until somebody else decides to take it. And so there would really be no such thing as property. But what is stealing? It's taking somebody else's property. And so if there's no such thing as property, there's no such thing as stealing. So there literally could not be a situation where everybody operates by the rule, steal from other people. There would be no such thing as stealing. So stealing is wrong. It is impossible for everyone to go around following that rule. Stealing ends up being unjust. Well, there's a general pattern here. Kant reminds us of a distinction that goes all the way back to Cicero, and Cicero himself attributes it to some earlier Greek Stoic thinkers, between perfect and imperfect obligations. A perfect obligation is a specific obligation to specific people. It gives other people rights, and it's unjust to violate them. So if I make a promise to you, I have a perfect obligation to fulfill that promise. I've made a specific promise to a specific person. And so I have an obligation that is perfect. Here in the Latin, it really just means a complete obligation, a complete duty. That is to say, it's specific, it's specified in these details, and I've got to do it. It gives you rights. It's unjust for me to violate that kind of obligation. An imperfect obligation is still an obligation, but imperfect here just means incomplete. It allows me choice in how to fulfill it. It doesn't give anybody else any rights. So it would be wrong to violate this, but it's not unjust. It doesn't do an injustice to anyone in particular. So let's say I have an imperfect obligation to be charitable, to help other people in need. Indeed, help others is one of those 7 basic principles that W.D. Ross outlined as part of common sense ethics. I should help other people. Well, let's grant that that's true, that I do have an obligation to help others. There is no specific person that as a result I have to help. So nobody else has a right to my help. If you come say, hey, look, I'm preparing for this exam. Help me study. Somebody who says, I have a general obligation to help people, but that doesn't mean I have to help you in particular. Or if somebody comes to your door and asks for a contribution to a certain charity, it might be that you have an obligation to help other people. This would be one way of doing it, but there are many ways of doing it. You have choice among those ways. So they have no right to your contribution, and you're not committing an injustice if you say, no, I prefer to help in other ways. So there's a fundamental difference between a promise and just a general obligation to be charitable. There's a fundamental difference between an obligation not to hurt others, which is perfect and which does give them rights not to be harmed by you, and then an imperfect obligation to help others, which doesn't give anybody else a right to your help. Well, Kant thinks about perfect obligations here first, and I'll consider in this video just the perfect ones. The first one he talks about is a perfect obligation to yourself not to commit suicide. That's a controversial case, and his reasoning there is somewhat convoluted. So I'm not really going to talk about that. I'm going to go on to the second case, to repay debts, or more generally, to keep promises. What's wrong with breaking a promise? Kant says, well, it violates this version of the categorical imperative. And here's why. Suppose we've got somebody who is low on cash, facing hard times, and really would like to borrow money. But he realizes he's not going to be in a situation to repay it. He'd promised to repay, but he couldn't do it. It would be a false promise, and he was bound to break it. Is it morally acceptable? So Kant says, suppose you're in a situation where you're forced by necessity to borrow money. You know you won't be able to repay it, but you also know nothing's going to be lent to you unless you do make the promise to repay it. So, is it okay? Is it consistent with duty to make a false promise in that way? Well, suppose you decide you're going to do it. The maxim would be, well, when I think myself in want of money, I'll borrow money and promise to repay it, though I know I can't. Now, he says, that may be consistent with your whole future welfare. In other words, you might get away with that, but the question is it right? Is it morally acceptable? Well, now the second part of the test. I take that maxim and I make it universal. I try to apply it across the board. So how would it be if my maxim were a universal law? That really is the heart of Kant's test. How would it be if my maxim were a universal law? If everybody went around making false promises, breaking promises, and so on. So I'm thinking about that question. What if everyone did that, is the key question here. Then I see at once that it could never hold as a universal law of nature, but would necessarily contradict itself. Now why? Well, suppose everybody who thought himself in difficulty should be able to promise whatever he pleases, while not planning at all to fulfill that promise. The promise itself would become impossible, as well as the end you might have in view of it, since no one would consider that anything was promised to him, but would ridicule all such statements as vain pretenses. In other words, suppose we had the rule, hey, you can make false promises, you can break promises. Then Kant's point is, then there's no such thing as a promise. Okay, when I make a promise to you, when I sign a contract, when I make a commitment, I am committing myself to do this. And if there's no obligation to do it, that commitment is meaningless. The promise is meaningless. So suppose we all have a rule and we all know there's a rule. You don't have to keep your commitments. You don't have to keep contracts and fulfill them. You don't have to fulfill your promises. You can break them. Then you come to me and say, could I borrow some money? I promise I'll repay. It's sort of like in the old Popeye cartoons where a character comes up and says, I will gladly pay you Tuesday for a hamburger today. And he always does this and he never pays. Well, if everyone did that all the time, if everyone did, then they'd say, I promise. And you just, yeah, that doesn't mean anything, right? If there's no obligation to keep your promises, no obligation to keep your commitments, there's no way to make a promise. There's no way to make a commitment. So in short, the entire system of promising, of contracts, of making commitments would fall apart. There would be no way to do it. So Kant says it is absolutely morally unacceptable. It is unjust. So here is an outline of the reasoning in short. Our maxim, make false promises. What if everybody did that? There would be no such thing as promising. It would be impossible to make a promise. No one would take it seriously. So making false promises is unjust. It is wrong. We have a perfect obligation to keep our promises. And that kind of reasoning, Kant says, is what we can subject anything that seems like it might be a perfect obligation to. We're going to find out what our perfect obligations are in exactly that way. What if everyone did it? If the answer is, if everyone did it, there'd be no such thing as what I'm relying on. You mustn't do it.